There's plenty more that could be said about the knowledge norm of assertion, but we're going to leave it there for today. Because as I said, that's kind of a bridge question from the things we've been thinking about in the first half of the semester to the things that we're going to be thinking about in the second half. The second question we're going to think about, and which is going to be more like the kinds of things we're going to be thinking about from here on out, is the question, just what does it take to be making an assertion? The knowledge norm of assertion and other norms of assertion distinguish correct assertions from incorrect assertions, but they don't distinguish just assertions from non-assertions, period. So there is this latter question, what does it take to be making an assertion? And this is what we're going to be thinking about. And in particular, we're going to put three accounts on the table today. One is a conventional account, and the conventional account says you are asserting P just in case you're following the conventions for asserting P. So in this picture, assertion is a sort of conventional practice. It's a practice that exists because of conventions, and you count as asserting something just in case you're following those conventions. In a similar sort of vein, there's also a constitutive rule account. This style account says that you're making an assertion just in case you're engaging in a practice with a particular kind of constitutive rule. And we can figure out what that practice is by identifying what the constitutive rule is. Williamson thinks it's the knowledge norm of assertion. Finally, and perhaps more differently from the other two accounts, there's an intention-based account. And I'll put it roughly now that the intention-based account says that you're asserting that P just in case you have a particular kind of intention, a particular kind of complex intention for what your audience is going to take from what you said. So these are the three kinds of different accounts. As I said before, the role for today is not going to be to get into the nitty-gritty of all the arguments pro and con these different styles of account. Our main objective is going to be to put these on the table, to start seeing the different kinds of ways we could view linguistic practice more generally. So for the rest of this video, let's start by thinking about the convention-based account. And to start thinking about that, we got to ask, well, what is a convention in the first place? I won't define what a convention is because we're going to see definitions of that later and it's a complex question in itself. But as we'll take it for now, we'll understand a convention to be a sort of socially instituted rule that says when the circumstances are right, that you count as doing something by doing something else. So that's very abstract. So let's see a few examples to flesh that out. One classic example is in a marriage ceremony where at the right point you say, I do. It looks like by saying that, you thereby become married. But this is a conventional thing. We have sort of set up the rules in such a way that when you say those words in the right circumstances, you thereby become married. That's what happens. So there's a convention. The convention says, in circumstances XYZ, when you say I do, you become married. So that's an example whereby we are successful in doing something because there's a convention in place that tells us when we're doing it. Another kind of convention, so one kind of convention is that when you raise a white flag, you surrender in a conflict. That's a rule that we've just instituted, but it is a rule that in a certain kind of case, namely one of conflict, when you raise a white flag, you are thereby surrendering. So you're not merely claiming that you're surrendering. To raise the white flag just is to surrender because of the rules that we've set up. One very last example, in certain games, referees or umpires can make decisions to eject players from the game. Here there seems to be a convention that when, in normal circumstances of play, if the umpire says you're out, then you're out. The umpire saying that you're out in a certain kind of situation is exactly what it takes for you to go out. So the umpire is not merely reporting on something that's happening, they're actually instituting the fact that the player is being ejected. So these are all examples where there's a certain kind of convention in play and where people get to do things just because they're following certain kinds of conventions. And one thought you might have is that assertion is a practice just like that. Maybe just as there are conventions for all sorts of things like marriage and surrender and playing games, there are also just conventions for linguistic communication. This isn't a crazy thought because there clearly is some naturalness to the idea that convention plays some role in how language is used. You might think, as we'll see later, that conventions are used to fix the meanings of words. So you might also think what you end up doing with your words is also a matter of convention. Now, this is a general view of speech acts. You might think all speech acts are governed by certain conventions, and for any speech act, you only count as doing that speech act just in case you're following the convention. But we're going to focus more narrowly on assertion. And if you had the conventional view of assertion, what you'd be saying is that somebody asserts that P just in case they satisfy the convention governing asserting P. So you succeed in asserting something just in case you follow the conventions for doing so and you're in the right situation. So succeeding in asserting something on this view would be importantly similar to things like raising the white flag, saying I do, or being ejected from a game. There are certain rules socially instituted for how you do it, and once you follow them in the right circumstances, you automatically count as doing it. This might seem like a kind of natural view at first, because as I said, it already seems reasonable to think that conventions play an important use in language somehow. However, when you start to think about how exactly this should get spelled out, you begin to realize that maybe the account is less promising than it might have initially seemed. Because the account talks about the conventions governing what it takes to assert P. But what are those conventions? What are the conventions governing what it takes to assert P? In all the other cases that we've seen so far, it's very easy to say what the conventions are. The convention for getting married is just saying I do in the context of a marriage ceremony. Surrendering, the convention for surrendering is even simpler. It's just raising a white flag in the course of conflict. By contrast, it's a lot harder to say what would the conventions be in the case of assertion that say, by following these rules in the right cases, you count as asserting. And importantly, we can see what a tall order this is by looking at particular uses of sentences and seeing that they can be used to assert various different things that might be extremely different. And when we start to see this, maybe the prospects for a conventional account seem to become quite bleak. So just take a simple example. Let's focus on the sentence, they must be great friends. We can imagine two different cases where I might be saying this. So we're watching two people. Maybe in the first case, Alice is helping Billy move. So Billy's moving out of his house, Alice is there helping him. In that situation, clearly I'm asserting something I genuinely believe. I'm doing it ingenuously. I'm asserting what the sentence literally means. By contrast, imagine we're watching Alice and Billy having a screaming match, and I say they must be great friends. Here I've still asserted something, but I've asserted something very different. I'm not asserting what the sentence literally says. Rather, I'm asserting something more like the opposite. I'm saying that they're behaving like mortal enemies or something like that. So simply saying the same sentence can obviously lead to me asserting different kinds of things depending on what's going on. And the challenge is, well, what would the conventions be like such that they say in the one case, I end up asserting that they are indeed great friends, and in the second case, I end up asserting that they're mortal enemies or something like that. What would those conventions be? It's kind of hard to see what they would be. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind may be like you have to say it in a particular kind of way, with a particular kind of tone of voice. But you can quickly see that that won't really do it by itself, because I could say they must be great friends in a completely deadpan way. In fact, the point of my utterance, I might be making a joke, and the most effective way to make the joke might be to say it as literal-like a way as possible. If that's the case, it becomes hard to see, well, what are the social conventions that are supposed to tell us that the first is a case of sincere assertion, the other is a case of irony or sarcasm. When you think about it, it's hard to find any rule in general, which is going to always tell you when something is being asserted sincerely or something is being asserted sarcastically or ironically. Just so much depends on the circumstances. Now, this isn't by any means a knockdown objection. Maybe there are ways around it. The point is more just to say it just looks kind of like a tall order to spell out exactly what the conventions are. because this account has a big promissory note. It has built into it this notion of the conventions of assertion. But if we just can't say what those are or what they would be, then that just might make us skeptical that there really are any such things, and that assertion really is a conventional practice at all. Now, we have to be careful to remember that by saying that some features of language aren't conventional, we don't have to say that none of language is conventional. We could reject the idea that assertion is conventional while still thinking that meaning, what words mean, is governed by convention. So just be careful to keep in mind that if you were to put aside the conventional account of assertion, that doesn't mean you're saying convention plays no role whatsoever, which is, of course, a good thing because that might seem sort of absurd to some people. So that's all we're going to say about the conventional account for now. We have introduced the idea of a convention. This is a notion that we're going to come back to multiple times. We're going to say more about it. We're going to flesh it out. We have a sense of what it might mean to say that assertion is a conventional practice, that there are conventions for assertion. But the main challenge to this account just seems to be to spell out what these conventions are. It's not totally obvious what the conventions are. And when you look at the wide range of different cases, you can use even the same sentence to assert different things. You might get sort of pessimistic about the possibility of spelling out what those conventions are.